Bandits surrounded the obese girl at midnight. Then the mountain man appeared, swinging an axe. The frontier settlement of Harrow's Creek sat at the very edge of civilization in the year 1794, where the Appalachian foothills gave way to endless forests that stretched westward into territory most white settlers had never seen. It was a place where survival depended on strength, speed, and the ability to defend oneself, qualities that Mary Ann Pritchard had been told her entire life she did not possess. At 19 years old, Mary Ann was the largest woman in Harrow's Creek, perhaps in all the surrounding territories. Her frame was substantial, her movements deliberate rather than quick, and her face round and soft in a world that seemed to value only sharp angles and lean muscle. The other settlers made no secret of their opinions. The women whispered behind their hands at Sunday gatherings. The men joked openly at the trading post. Children, with the casual cruelty of youth, would sometimes follow her down the muddy main street, making exaggerated waddling motions until their mothers called them back. Too slow for farm work, they said, too soft for frontier life, too useless to marry off. Mary Ann lived with her father, William Pritchard, a widower who ran a small dry goods store at the edge of town. Her mother had died of fever 3 winters past, and since then Mary Ann had managed the household, tended the vegetable garden behind their log cabin, and helped her father with the accounts work she performed with quiet competence that no one seemed to notice. What the settlers of Harrow's Creek did not know was that Mary Ann possessed a mind as sharp as any blade. She could calculate sums faster than the town's only schoolmaster. She could read not only English, but French, taught to her by her mother, who had come from a Huguenot family in Virginia. She knew the name of every plant in the surrounding forest, which were medicinal and which were poison, knowledge gleaned from long conversations with the few Native American women who occasionally came to trade at her father's store. But none of this mattered to people who judged worth by appearance alone. 10 miles north of Harrow's Creek, in a rough-hewn cabin surrounded by spruce and hemlock, lived a man the settlers called the Mountain Man, though his given name was Josiah Stone. Josiah was 32 years old and had lived alone in the wilderness for 7 years. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick, dark beard that he trimmed only occasionally, and long hair he kept tied back with a leather cord. His face bore the scars of his solitary life, a jagged line across his left cheekbone from a bear encounter, smaller marks from branches and thorns, and a hardness in his gray eyes that made most people look away. He came to Harrow's Creek only 4 times a year, carrying bundles of fur to trade for the few supplies he could not make or hunt himself salt, powder, lead, needles, and occasionally a book. For Josiah could read and crave the company of words when human company had failed him so completely. The settlers feared him in the peculiar way frontier people feared those who rejected settlement itself. He spoke rarely and only when necessary. He conducted his business quickly and left before nightfall, as though the proximity of other humans caused him physical pain. Children were warned not to approach him. Women crossed to the other side of the street. Men nodded respectfully, but kept their distance. No one knew why Josiah Stone had retreated from civilization, and no one dared to ask. It was a cold afternoon in late October when Mary Ann first spoke to the Mountain Man. She had been tending her father's store while William was in the back room inventorying their stock of flour and cornmeal. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of wind that smelled of pine and coming snow, and Josiah Stone ducked through the low doorway, a bundle of beaver pelts over one shoulder. The store was empty, except for Mary Ann. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, she behind the rough plank counter, he standing in the doorway like a wild thing that had accidentally wandered into a cage. "Good afternoon," Mary Ann said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "What can I help you with today, Mr. Stone?" He seemed surprised that she knew his name. Most people simply called him that mountain man, or the hermit, or less charitable things. "Salt," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Powder, lid, needles if you have them." "We do," Mary Ann said, and began gathering the items from the shelves behind her. As she worked, she was acutely aware of his presence, of the way he stood very still, watching her movements with an intensity that might have been frightening. If not for something else she detected beneath it, a kind of lonely curiosity, as though he were observing a creature from another world. When she had assembled his supplies on the counter, she tallied the cost in her head. "That will be $3.40, Mr. Stone, or we can trade for those pelts if you prefer." "Trade," he said, and laid the beaver bundle on the counter. Mary Ann examined the furs with practiced hands. They were prime pelts, well cleaned and dried, worth considerably more than the supplies he was purchasing. She named a fair price that would leave him credit for his next visit. For the first time, Josiah Stone's hard expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You know furs?" he said. It was not quite a question. "My mother taught me," Mary Ann replied. "She said a merchant who couldn't judge quality was a merchant who'd soon be out of business." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his bearded face. "Your mother was a wise woman?" "Yes," Mary Ann said quietly. "She was." They stood in silence for a moment, and then Josiah gathered his supplies. But before he reached the door, he paused and turned back. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't shortchange me. Not everyone is honest." Mary Ann felt a flush of warmth at the unexpected compliment. "My father raised me to deal fairly with everyone, Mr. Stone." He nodded once, then was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. It was such a small interaction, hardly worth remembering by most standards, but Mary Ann found herself thinking about it as she went about her evening chores, thinking about the loneliness she had glimpsed beneath the mountain man's fearsome exterior, and recognizing it because she carried a loneliness of her own. Over the following months, whenever Josiah Stone came to trade, he made a point of conducting his business when Mary Ann was minding the store. Their conversations remained brief and practical, but Mary Ann began to notice small changes. He no longer left immediately after completing his trade. Sometimes he would linger for a few minutes, examining the store's meager collection of books, or commenting on the weather, or asking careful questions about frontier news. Once, when a group of men came into the store while Josiah was there and began making their usual crude jokes about Mary Ann's size, the mountain man had turned to look at them with such cold, focused intensity that the words died in their throats. The men had completed their purchases in uncomfortable silence and left quickly. After they were gone, Josiah had simply said, "Fools," and Mary Ann had felt something unfold in her chest that she had not experienced in years, the feeling of being defended, of mattering to someone. She began to look forward to his visits. She started setting aside books she thought he might enjoy, loaning them to him without charge. She saved him the best cuts of salt pork when they were fresh. Once she gave him a small jar of honey she had bartered for, claiming they had extra, though in truth it was her own precious supply. Josiah accepted these small kindnesses with a kind of wondering gratitude, as though he had forgotten that humans were capable of generosity without expectation of return. "You're different from the others," he said to her once, on a gray December afternoon when snow was beginning to fall outside. "So are you," Mary Ann replied. Their eyes met, and in that moment an understanding passed between them and recognition of shared outsider status, of the particular pain of being judged and found wanting by a community that claimed to value Christian charity, but practiced only conditional acceptance. It was in early March of 1795 that Josiah first heard the rumors that would change everything. He had come to Harrow's Creek to trade winter furs, arriving at midday when the settlement was busy with commerce and gossip. As he conducted his business at various establishments, he caught fragments of conversations that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle with warning. A gang of bandits had been operating in the territory for the past month, he learned. They were led by a man called Rake Donovan, a former militiaman turned outlaw, who had gathered around him a group of deserters, fugitives, and violent opportunists. The gang had robbed 2 farmsteads to the east, burned out a family to the south, and murdered a traveling preacher whose only crime had been carrying a silver pocket watch. But it was a conversation in the tavern that truly alarmed Josiah. He had stopped there briefly, something he rarely did to warm himself before the long trek back to his cabin. In the dim, smoky interior, he heard a group of men talking in low voices at a corner table. "Donovan's gang is coming this way," one of them said. "They'll hit Harrow's Creek within the week." "What are they after?" another asked. "What they're always after: money, food, weapons, whatever they can steal, and—" The speaker lowered his voice further, but Josiah's sharp hearing caught the words. "Heard them say they want the Pritchard store. Old man William supposedly keeps a strong box of silver coins." "Does he?" "Don't know, don't care, but I heard something else too. They were laughing about the daughter, saying how no one would come to her defense if they, well, you know, saying how no one would even miss her." The men laughed uneasily, and Josiah's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. A cold rage, different from any anger he had known before, settled into his bones. He left the tavern without finishing his drink and went directly to the trading post, but found only William Pritchard there, looking tired and older than his 50 years. "Mr. Pritchard," Josiah said without preamble, "there are bandits coming. Within the week, maybe sooner. You and your daughter should go to one of the larger settlements until they're caught." William looked up in surprise. "Bandits? I've heard rumors, but—" "Not rumors," Josiah said flatly. "Truth. They mean to rob you and possibly worse. You need to leave." But William shook his head stubbornly. "I can't abandon my store, Mr. Stone. Everything I own is invested in this place. If bandits come, the men of Harrow's Creek will defend it. We have a militia." Josiah wanted to argue, wanted to explain that the so-called militia was made up of farmers and shopkeepers who had never faced truly violent men. But he saw the rigid pride in William's face and knew he would not be persuaded. "At least send Mary Ann away," he tried. "Send her to Virginia, to relatives." "My daughter is not a child, Mr. Stone. She makes her own decisions. And besides, where would she go? We have no close family remaining." William's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate your concern, truly, but we'll be fine." Josiah left the trading post with a sense of deep foreboding. That evening, instead of returning to his cabin, he made camp in the forest north of Harrow's Creek and began to scout the surrounding territory. For 3 days, Josiah tracked through the wilderness, looking for signs of the bandit gang. His skills as a hunter and woodsman, honed over 7 years of solitary life, served him well. He found their camp on the 3rd day, a rough collection of canvas shelters in a ravine 15 miles northeast of Harrow's Creek. From a hidden vantage point, he counted 12 men. They were well armed with rifles, pistols, and knives, and they moved with the casual violence of those who had long ago abandoned any pretense of civilization. He watched as they cleaned weapons, drank whiskey, and talked in voices that occasionally carried up to his hiding place. 3 more days, he heard Rake Donovan say. The gang leader was a thin man with lank, dark hair and a face that might have been handsome had it not been twisted by cruelty. "We hit them at night. Get the silver, get supplies, burn what we can't carry." "What about the fat girl?" one of the others called out, to general laughter. "Oh, we'll have our fun with that one," Donovan said. "I hear she's all alone most nights, minding her papa's store. We'll pay her a visit first before we hit the main settlement. No one's going to come running to save her, are they? They'll probably thank us for doing them a favor." The other men laughed, and Josiah had to press his hand against his mouth to keep from roaring with rage and giving away his position. That night, he returned to his cabin, gathered supplies and weapons, and began to plan. 1 man against 12 was not good odds, but Josiah had never expected to be fighting alongside others. The wilderness had taught him to rely only on himself, but more than that, a clarity had settled over him, sharp and cold as winter starlight. For 7 years he had lived apart from humanity, believing himself too broken and too dangerous to be around others. For 7 years he had told himself he needed no one, that isolation was safer than connection. But Mary Ann Pritchard had looked at him without fear. She had spoken to him with respect and kindness. She had treated him as though he were a human being rather than a monster, and in doing so had reminded him that he still was one. He would not let those animals touch her. It happened on a Friday night, 5 days after Josiah had first heard the rumors. Mary Ann was closing up the store, performing her usual evening routine, banking the fire in the stove, sweeping the floor, checking that the windows were shuttered securely. Her father had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache, so Mary Ann worked alone in the dim light of 2 tallow candles. Outside, the March night was cold and dark, with heavy clouds obscuring the moon and promising rain before morning. She was just reaching for her cloak, preparing to walk the short distance from the store to their cabin, when she heard the sound of horses and rough voices outside. Mary Ann's breath caught. Something about those voices, their coarse laughter, their deliberate loudness, sent a primal warning through her body. She quickly snuffed out the candles and moved away from the door, pressing herself against the wall in the shadows. The door burst open. 6 men poured into the store, carrying torches that sent wild shadows dancing across the walls. "Well, well," said the leader, a thin man with cruel eyes. "Look what we have here, the fat little merchant girl all alone." Mary Ann tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The men spread out, blocking every exit, moving closer with the practiced efficiency of wolves cornering prey. "Please," Mary Ann said, hating the tremor in her voice, "take whatever you want from the store. Just leave me alone." "Oh, we'll take what we want," Rake Donovan said, and his men laughed. "But you see, girl, what we want includes you." They moved closer, forming a tightening circle. Mary Ann looked frantically for a weapon, for any means of escape, but found nothing. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "No one's coming to help you," one of the bandits sneered. "No one in this whole damn town cares if you live or die." And in that moment, Mary Ann realized with cold, terrible clarity that he was probably right. She opened her mouth to scream anyway, but a hand clamped over her face, rough and smelling of tobacco and violence. The bandits dragged her toward the door. She fought as hard as she could, kicking and struggling, but her terror made her clumsy, and there were too many of them. They pulled her out into the street, into the cold darkness where the only light came from their torches. "Might as well do this here in the street," Donovan said. "Let the whole town see what happens to people we visit. Let them know what's coming for the rest of them." Mary Ann was thrown to the ground. She landed hard in the cold mud, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. Through tear-blurred eyes, she saw the bandit standing over her, saw the knives glinting in the torchlight. She tried to scream again, but only a whimper emerged. The church bell in the town square began to toll midnight, its slow, solemn chimes marking the darkest hour. And then everything changed. The roar that split the night was not human, or if it was, it came from something that had spent too long in the wild places to be fully civilized anymore. Out of the darkness, moving faster than something his size should have been able to move, came Josiah Stone. He was covered in 3 days of wilderness travel mud, snow, and probably blood, his hair wild around his face, his gray eyes reflecting torchlight like an animal's. In his hands, he carried his woodcutter's axe, the same tool he used to split logs for his cabin, but in that moment it looked like an ancient weapon of war. The bandits barely had time to turn before he was upon them. The first swing of the axe shattered the rifle of the nearest bandit, sending splinters of wood flying. Before the man could react, Josiah's fist connected with his jaw, and the bandit dropped like a stone. "Get him!" Donovan shouted, but his voice was tinged with fear. 2 more bandits rushed forward. Josiah spun, bringing the flat of the axe blade around to catch one man in the ribs with a sickening crack. The other managed to draw a knife, but Josiah caught his wrist, twisted, and the bandit's own momentum sent him sprawling face first into the mud. It was chaos, violent, terrifying, and over almost before it began. The bandits were armed and had the advantage of numbers, but they were used to victims who didn't fight back, to soft targets and easy prey. Josiah Stone was neither soft nor easy, and he fought with the desperate ferocity of a man who had finally found something worth protecting. Another bandit went down, clutching his broken arm. Another fled into the darkness. A pistol fired, the shot going wild, and then Josiah's axe came down on the weapon itself, demolishing it. Rake Donovan, seeing his men falling or fleeing, made a calculation. He grabbed the one remaining bandit who hadn't run and shouted, "Fall back! Back to the horses!" The 2 of them ran, leaving 4 of their companions unconscious or groaning on the ground. The thunder of hoofbeats faded into the distance, and then there was only silence except for the gasping breaths of combat and the dying echoes of midnight's final chime. Josiah stood in the center of the muddy street, axe still in hand, looking like some figure from ancient legend. Then his eyes found Mary Ann, still huddled on the ground, and all the wildness seemed to drain out of him. He dropped the axe and fell to his knees beside her. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, desperate. "Did they—" "No," Mary Ann managed to say, though she was shaking so hard she could barely form words. You came in time." By now, the commotion had roused the settlement. Men emerged from their homes carrying lanterns and weapons. Women peered fearfully from doorways, and soon a crowd had gathered, staring in shock at the scene, the unconscious bandits, the wild-eyed mountain man, and Mary Ann Pritchard on the ground. William Pritchard pushed through the crowd, his face white with terror. "Mary Ann, dear God!" "I'm all right, Papa," Mary Ann said, though she still couldn't stop shaking. "Mr. Stone saved me." "The bandits," Josiah said, forcing himself to his feet and addressing the crowd. "They were going to raid the settlement. They started with her." His jaw clenched. "They said no one would defend her. They said no one would miss her." A horrible, guilty silence fell over the gathered townsfolk. Mary Ann saw shame on some faces, defiance on others, but mostly she saw the uncomfortable realization that what Josiah said was probably true. "How did you know?" William asked, his voice shaking. "How did you know to be here?" "I heard them talking in the tavern days ago," Josiah said. "I tracked them, followed them. I was waiting for them to make their move." He looked down at Mary Ann, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I couldn't let them hurt her." "But why?" one of the townsmen asked. "She's nothing to you. You barely know her." Josiah was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Because she's the only person in 7 years who looked at me like I was human," he said. "The only person who treated me with kindness when she had no reason to. The only person who saw past what I looked like, past what people said about me, and treated me with respect." His eyes never left Mary Ann's face. "You all said she was too slow, too soft, too useless. But you were wrong. She's worth more than all of you put together." Mary Ann felt tears sliding down her face, but they were no longer tears of fear. No one had ever defended her like this. No one had ever said such things about her, especially not in front of the whole community. Josiah extended his hand to her. "Can you stand?" Mary Ann took his hand, rough, calloused, strong, and let him pull her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and without hesitation he wrapped his arm around her shoulders to steady her. "I'll take you home," he said softly. "You shouldn't be alone tonight." But Mary Ann found herself leaning into his solid warmth, her hand clutching the rough fabric of his coat. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." "You saved mine first," Josiah replied. "You just didn't know it." The aftermath of that night brought changes to Harrow's Creek that no one could have anticipated. The 4 captured bandits were taken into custody by the settlement's makeshift militia and later transported to the nearest town with a proper jail. Rake Donovan and his remaining men were never seen in the territory again, though rumors suggested they had fled south and met their end in a skirmish with Creek warriors. Josiah Stone, instead of immediately retreating to his mountain cabin as everyone expected, stayed in Harrow's Creek. At first, He told himself it was only practical to make sure there was no retaliation from any other members of Donovan's gang to ensure Mary Ann and her father were truly safe. He made camp in the forest just outside the settlement, close enough to respond if there was trouble, but far enough to maintain the distance he had always kept from civilization. But every day he found excuses to come into town, to check on the Pritchards, to trade news about any suspicious activity in the surrounding wilderness, to accept, somewhat awkwardly, the gratitude of a community that had previously viewed him with fear and suspicion. And every day he made sure to stop at the trading post, where Mary Ann would smile at him with such warmth that it made something in his chest ache with unfamiliar emotion. "You don't have to keep watching over us," she told him one afternoon, about a week after the attack. They were standing outside the store, ostensibly discussing the signs of an early spring, but really just finding excuses to be near each other. "I know," Josiah said, "but you're still here." "Yes." Mary Ann studied his face, still hard and scarred, but no longer quite so frightening now that she had seen the gentleness beneath. "Why, Mr. Stone?" "Josiah," he said. "My name is Josiah, and I think you know why." She did know, had known since that night when he had appeared out of darkness like an avenging angel, had known from the way he looked at her as though she were something precious, rather than something to be pitied or mocked. But knowing and speaking aloud were two different things, and both of them had been lonely for so long that the prospect of connection was almost more frightening than the alternative. Spring came to the frontier in fits and starts, warm days followed by cold nights, mud everywhere, and the constant sound of snowmelt rushing down from the mountains. Josiah continued to linger in the area, and gradually his presence became less that of a visiting guardian and more that of a member of the community. He helped William Pritchard repair the store's roof after winter damage. He brought fresh game to the settlement to trade. He even began to speak more freely with the other men, though he still kept a certain distance. But it was with Mary Ann that the real transformation occurred. They spent hours together, these two outsiders who had found each other at the edge of civilization. Mary Ann would lend him books, and they would discuss them with an intensity that surprised them both. Josiah taught her to identify animal tracks and predict weather changes by reading the sky. She taught him to appreciate poetry and shared with him the few treasured volumes that had belonged to her mother. "You're educated," Mary Ann observed one afternoon as they sat on the porch of the trading post, watching spring rain fall from a gray sky. "More than most people realize." Josiah was quiet for a moment. "I had another life before this one," he finally said, "before the mountains. Will you tell me about it?" He had never told anyone, not in 7 years. But Mary Ann sat beside him with patient, non-judgmental attention, and somehow the words came. "I was a school teacher," he said, "in a settlement in western Pennsylvania. I was engaged to be married to a woman named Sarah Whitmore. She was—" He paused, searching for words. "She was beautiful, delicate, everything a woman was supposed to be." Mary Ann felt a pang in her chest, but said nothing, just waited for him to continue. "2 weeks before our wedding, there was an Indian raid. Delaware warriors angry about treaty violations. Sarah was staying with her sister on the outskirts of the settlement when it happened." Josiah's voice went flat, emotionless, in the way of someone recounting unbearable pain. "I heard the shooting and ran toward it. By the time I got there, her sister's family was dead, but Sarah was still alive, being dragged toward the forest. "What did you do?" Mary Ann asked softly. "I killed 2 of the warriors with an axe, the same axe I still carry. Killed them to save Sarah." His hands clenched. "She was alive. I saved her life. But when she looked at me, covered in blood, with that axe in my hands, she screamed like I was the monster, not the men who had killed her family. She said she could never marry someone capable of such violence, could never look at me without seeing those deaths. Josiah? So I left. Told myself if I looked like a monster to her, maybe that's what I was. Came west, into the wilderness, where being violent and dangerous was necessary for survival, where I wouldn't have to see that look of fear in anyone's eyes again." Mary Ann reached out and took his hand. "You're not a monster," she said firmly. "You did what you had to do to save someone you loved, and if she couldn't understand that, then she didn't deserve you." Josiah looked at their joined hands as though he had never seen such a thing before. "You don't fear me," he said, "even after seeing what I did to those bandits, even knowing what I'm capable of." "I fear you as little as you fear me," Mary Ann replied. "We both know what it's like to be judged unfairly, to be seen as something other than what we are." And in that moment, sitting on the porch of a frontier trading post while spring rain fell around them, something shifted between them, an understanding that deepened into recognition. Recognition that warmed into affection, affection that promised to grow into something neither of them had expected to find. By midsummer, it had become obvious to everyone in Harrow's Creek that the mountain man and Mary Ann Pritchard were courting, though neither of them had made any formal declaration. Josiah had moved his camp closer, taking up temporary residence in an abandoned trapper's cabin just 2 miles from the settlement. He came into town almost daily, always with some excuse game to trade, news to share, supplies to purchase, but everyone knew the real reason was Mary Ann. They took long walks together in the surrounding forest, Mary Ann learning wilderness skills from Josiah while he learned about medicinal plants from her. They sat together during Sunday services, Josiah's presence in the church causing initial consternation, until the preacher decided that getting the mountain man to attend worship was a miracle not to be questioned. The settlement's attitude toward both of them began to change. Mary Ann was no longer the object of mockery, but of a kind of puzzled respect. Clearly, she had qualities they had failed to perceive if she had captured the attention of a man as formidable as Josiah Stone. And Josiah was no longer the frightening hermit, but the hero who had saved one of their own. But still, no official declaration was made, and Mary Ann began to wonder if perhaps she had misread the situation. Perhaps Josiah valued her as a friend, but nothing more. Perhaps she was foolish to hope for anything deeper. It was on a warm evening in late August that the truth finally emerged. A traveling preacher had come through Harrow's Creek, bringing news from the eastern settlements and officiating at the wedding of a young couple. The whole settlement gathered for the celebration, which included a feast, dancing, and general merriment. Mary Ann attended with her father, wearing her best dress, a simple blue cotton that she had sewn herself. She stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the newlyweds dance, feeling the familiar ache of loneliness that such celebrations always brought. Then a shadow fell across her. and she looked up to find Josiah standing beside her, looking uncomfortable in clothes that were slightly too clean to suit him. "I don't know how to dance," he said abruptly. Mary Ann blinked in surprise. Neither do I. Not really." "Good," Josiah said. "Then we can both be terrible at it together." And before she could respond, he took her hand and led her toward where other couples were moving in rough approximation of a Virginia reel. They were, in fact, quite terrible at dancing. Mary Ann stumbled over her own feet, and Josiah moved with the awkward stiffness of a man more comfortable fighting bears than performing social niceties. But they were terrible together, and after a few minutes they were both laughing, really laughing, in a way neither had done in years. When the song ended, Josiah did not release her hand. Instead, he drew her away from the crowd, toward the edge of the clearing where the forest began. "Mary Ann," he said, and the way he spoke her name made her breath catch. "I need to ask you something." "Yes?" "If I were to stay here, not in the mountains, but here, near the settlement, would that please you?" Mary Ann's heart began to race. "Yes," she said, "very much." "And if I were to build a cabin near town, with enough room for 2 people, and a garden, and maybe a workshop, would you want to see it?" "Josiah," Mary Ann whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "What are you asking?" He took both her hands in his, and in the twilight his eyes were very gray and very serious. "I'm asking if you would consider sharing that cabin with me as my wife. I know I'm not what most women would want. I'm rough and scarred and too comfortable with solitude, but you make me want to be part of the world again. You make me believe I could be something other than the monster I thought I was." Tears spilled down Mary Ann's cheeks. "And you make me believe I could be seen as something other than the useless fat girl everyone mocks," she said. "You see me, Josiah, really see me, and I see you too not a monster, but a good man who has been hurt and chose kindness anyway." "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Mary Ann said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Josiah pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that belied his strength, and there, at the edge of the forest, as firelight from the celebration flickered in the distance, he kissed her for the first time, softly, reverently, as though she were something infinitely precious. They were married in September in a ceremony that brought out the entire settlement. William Pritchard gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes, grateful that she had found someone who valued her as she deserved. Josiah had built them a sturdy cabin 2 miles from town, close enough to maintain community ties, but far enough to have privacy. It had a large main room with a stone fireplace, a separate bedroom, and a loft for storage. Behind the cabin, he had cleared land for a garden and built a small workshop where he could cure furs and work on various projects. Mary Ann brought to the marriage her books, her knowledge of plants and healing, and her sharp mind for figures. Josiah brought his wilderness skills, his strength, and a fierce protective devotion that never wavered. Their first year together was not without challenges. Both had spent so long as solitary figures that learning to share space and decisions required patience and compromise. Mary Ann had to learn to trust that Josiah would always return when he went hunting. Josiah had to learn that being married meant talking about his feelings rather than retreating into stoic silence. But they worked at it. These 2 people who had both known rejection and chosen resilience. They built routines together, Morning coffee shared while watching sunrise through their cabin window, evening walks to check trap lines, reading aloud to each other by firelight. Mary Ann continued to help her father at the trading post several days a week, and the business thrived under her management. Josiah became known as someone settlers could turn to for help with difficult problems, predators threatening livestock, tracking lost children, advice about surviving harsh winters. They became, in their own way, pillars of the Harrows Creek community, though neither would have believed such a thing possible a year earlier. In the spring of their second year together, Mary Ann discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified them both. Mary Ann worried that her body, which the world had told her was wrong and inadequate, would fail at this most fundamental task. Josiah worried that he would be a terrible father, that his years of isolation had broken something essential in him. But as summer turned to fall and Mary Ann's belly swelled with new life, their fears began to ease. Josiah became fiercely protective, insisting Mary Ann rest more, bringing her wild berries and fresh game, talking to her belly in the evenings as though the child could already hear him. "You're going to be so loved," he would murmur, his large hand spread across her rounded stomach. "So loved and so protected, and you'll never be judged for what you look like or who you are. I'll make sure of it." Mary Ann would run her fingers through his hair, marveling at the transformation in this man who had once lived as a hermit in the mountains. Their daughter was born on a cold December morning, with snow falling softly outside the cabin, and Mary Ann's father and a midwife from town in attendance. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Josiah, pacing frantically outside, feared he would lose both wife and child. But at dawn he heard the thin, outraged wail of a newborn, and moments later the midwife emerged to tell him he had a daughter. Josiah entered the bedroom to find Mary Ann exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft wool. The baby had dark hair like her father and Mary Ann's warm brown eyes. "Do you want to hold her?" Mary Ann asked. Josiah approached slowly, as though the child might break if he breathed too hard. But when Mary Ann placed the baby in his arms, something inside him that had been frozen for 8 years finally thawed completely. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your papa." They named her Sarah Grace Sarah for the woman Josiah had once loved, because he had finally forgiven both her and himself, and Grace because she was exactly that, a gift neither of them had expected, but both treasured beyond measure.